Dirk Peters. Hunt was the half-breed Dirk Peters, the devoted companion of Arthur Pym, he whom Captain Guy had so long sought for in the United States, and whose presence was probably to furnish us with a fresh reason for pursuing our daring campaign. I shall not be at all surprised if my readers have already recognized Dirk Peters in Hunt. Indeed, I shall be astonished if they have failed to do so. The extraordinary thing is that Captain Len Guy and myself, who had read Edgar Poe's book over and over again, did not see at once, when Hunt came on the ship at the Falklands, that he and the half-breed were identical. I can only admit that we were both blindfolded by some hidden action of fate, just when certain pages of that book ought to have effectually cleared our vision. There was no doubt whatever that Hunt really was Dirk Peters. Although he was 11 years older, he answered in every particular to the description of him given by Arthur Pym, except that he was no longer of fierce aspect. In fact, the half-breed had changed with age and the experience of terrible scenes through which he had passed. Nevertheless, he was still the faithful companion to whom Arthur Pym had often owed his safety, that same Dirk Peters who loved him as his own son, and who had never, no, never, lost the hope of finding him again one day amid the awful Antarctic wastes. Now, why had Dirk Peters hidden himself in the Falklands under the name of Hunt? Why, since his embarkation on the Halbrane, had he kept up that incognito? Why had he not told who he was, since he was aware of the intentions of the captain, who was about to make every effort to save his countrymen by following the course of the Jane? Why, no doubt because he feared that his name would inspire horror. Was it not the name of one who had shared in the horrible scenes of the Grampus, who had killed Parker, the sailor, who had fed upon the man's flesh, and quenched his thirst in the man's blood? To induce him to reveal his name, he must needs be assured that the Halbrane would attempt to discover and rescue Arthur Pym. And as to the existence of Arthur Pym, I confess that my reason did not rebel against the admission of it as a possibility. The imploring cry of the half-breed, "Pym, poor Pym, he must not be forsaken," troubled me profoundly. Assuredly, since I had resolved to take part in the expedition of the Halbrane, I was no longer the same man. A long silence had followed the astounding declaration of the half-breed. None dreamed of doubting his veracity. He had said, "I am Dirk Peters." He was Dirk Peters. At length, moved by irresistible impulse, I said, "My friends, before any decision is made, let us carefully consider the situation. Should we not lay up everlasting regret for ourselves if we were to abandon our expedition at the very moment when it promises to succeed? Reflect upon this, Captain, and you, my companions. It is less than 7 months since Patterson left your countrymen alive on Sallel Island. If they were there then, the fact proves that for 11 years they had been enabled to exist on the resources provided by the island, having nothing to fear from the islanders, some of whom had fallen victims to circumstances unknown to us, and others had probably transferred themselves to some neighboring island. This is quite plain, and I do not see how any objection can be raised to my reasoning." No one made answer. There was none to be made. "If we have not come across the captain of the Jane and his people," I resumed, "it is because they have been obliged to abandon Sallel Island since Patterson's departure. Why? In my belief, it was because the earthquake had rendered the island uninhabitable. Now, they would only have required a native boat to gain either another island or some point of the Antarctic continent by the aid of the southern current. I hardly hesitate to assert that all this has occurred, but in any case, I know, and I repeat, that we shall have done nothing if we do not persevere in the search on which the safety of your countrymen depends." I questioned my audience by a searching look. No answer. Captain Len Guy, whose emotion was unrestrained, bowed his head, for he felt that I was right, that by invoking the duties of humanity, I was prescribing the only course open to men with feeling hearts. "And what is in question?" I continued after the silent pause. "To accomplish a few degrees of latitude, and that while the sea is open, while we have 2 months of good weather to look for and nothing to fear from the southern winter, I certainly should not ask you to brave its severity. And shall we hesitate when the Halbrane is abundantly furnished, her crew complete and in good health? Shall we take fright at imaginary dangers? Shall we not have courage to go on thither? Dirk Peters shows the way. Dirk Peters shows the way." And I pointed to the southern horizon. Dirk Peters pointed to it also, with an imperative gesture which spoke for him. Still, the eyes of all were fixed upon us, but there was no response. I continued to urge every argument and to quote every example in favor of the safety of pursuing our voyage, but the silence was unbroken, and now the men stood with eyes cast down. And yet I had not once pronounced the name of Dirk Peters, nor alluded to Dirk Peters' proposal. I was asking myself whether I had or had not succeeded in inspiring my companions with my own belief, when Captain Len Guy spoke. "Dirk Peters," he said, "do you assert that Arthur Pym and you after your departure from Sallel Island saw land in the direction of the south?" "Yes, land," answered the half-breed. "Islands or continent understand me, and I believe that Pym, poor Pym, is waiting there until aid comes to him. There, where perhaps William Guy and his companions are also waiting," said I, to bring back the discussion to more practical points. Captain Len Guy reflected for a little while, and then spoke. "Is it true, Dirk Peters," he asked, "that beyond the 84th parallel the horizon is shut in by that curtain of vapor which is described in the narrative? Have you seen with your own eyes, those cataracts in the air, that gulf in which Arthur Pym's boat was lost?" The half-breed looked from one to the other of us, and shook his big head. "I don't know," he said. "What are you asking me about, Captain? A curtain of vapor? Yes, perhaps, and also appearances of land towards the south." Evidently Dirk Peters had never read Edgar Poe's book, and very likely did not know how to read. After having handed over Pym's journal, he had not troubled himself about its publication. Having retired to Illinois at first, and to the Falklands afterwards, he had no notion of the stir that the work had made, or of the fantastic and baseless climax to which our great poet had brought those strange adventures. And besides, might not Arthur Pym himself, with his tendency to the supernatural, have fancied that he saw these wondrous things, due solely to his imaginative brain? Then, for the first time in the course of this discussion, West's voice made itself heard. I had no idea which side he would take. The first words he uttered were, "Captain, your orders." Captain Len Guy turned towards his crew, who surrounded him, both the old and the new. Hearn remained in the background, ready to intervene if he should think it necessary. The captain questioned the boatswain and his comrades, whose devotion was unreservedly his, by a long and anxious look, and I heard him mutter between his teeth, "Ah, if it depended only on me, if I were sure of the assent and the help of them all." Then Hearn spoke roughly. "Captain," said he, "it's 2 months since we left the Falklands. Now, my companions were engaged for a voyage which was not to take them farther beyond the icebergs than Sallel Island." "That is not so," exclaimed Captain Len Guy. "No, that is not so. I recruited you all for an enterprise which I have a right to pursue so far as I please." "Beg pardon," said Hearn coolly, "but we have come to a point which no navigator has ever yet reached. In a sea, no ship except the Jane has ever ventured into before us, and therefore my comrades and I mean to return to the Falklands before the bad season. From there you can return to Sallel Island, and even go on to the Pole if you so please." A murmur of approbation greeted his words. No doubt the sealing master justly interpreted the sentiments of the majority, composed of the new recruits. To go against their opinion, to exact the obedience of these ill-disposed men, and under such conditions to risk the unknown Antarctic waters, would have been an act of temerity, or rather, an act of madness, that would have brought about some catastrophe. Nevertheless, West, advancing upon Hearn, said to him in a threatening tone, "Who gave you leave to speak?" "The captain questioned us," replied Hearn. "I had a right to reply." The man uttered these words with such insolence that West, who was generally so self-restrained, was about to give free vent to his wrath, when Captain Len Guy, stopping him by a motion of his hand, said quietly, "Be calm, Jem. Nothing can be done unless we are all agreed. What is your opinion, Herr Legerly?" "It is very clear, Captain," replied the boatswain. "I will obey your orders, whatever they may be. It is our duty not to forsake William Guy and the others so long as any chance of saving them remains." The boatswain paused for a moment, while several of the sailors gave unequivocal signs of approbation. "As for what concerns Arthur Pym—" "There is no question of Arthur Pym," struck in the captain, "but only of my brother William and his companions." I saw at this moment that Dirk Peters was about to protest, and caught hold of his arm. He shook with anger, but kept silence. The captain continued his questioning of the men, desiring to know by name all those upon whom he might reckon. The old crew to a man acquiesced in his proposals, and pledged themselves to obey his orders implicitly and follow him whithersoever he chose to go. 3 only of the recruits joined those faithful seamen. These were English sailors. The others were of Hearne's opinion, holding that for them the campaign was ended at Sallel Island. They therefore refused to go beyond that point, and formally demanded that the ship should be steered northward so as to clear the icebergs at the most favorable period of the season. 20 men were on their side, and to constrain them to lend a hand to the working of the ship, if she were to be diverted to the south, would have been to provoke them to rebel. There was but one resource: to arouse their covetousness, to strike the chord of self-interest. I intervened, therefore, and addressed them in a tone which placed the seriousness of my proposal beyond a doubt. Men of the Halbrane, listen to me. Just as various states have done for voyages of discovery in the polar regions, I offer a reward to the crew of this schooner. $2,000 shall be shared among you for every degree we make beyond the 84th parallel. Nearly $70 to each man. This was a strong temptation. I felt that I had hit the mark. I will sign an agreement to that effect, I continued, with Captain Len Guy as your representative, and the sums gained shall be handed to you on your return, no matter under what conditions that return be accomplished. I waited for the effect of this promise, and to tell the truth, I had not to wait long. Hurrah! Cried the boatswain, acting as fugleman to his comrades, who almost unanimously added their cheers to his. Hearne offered no farther opposition. It would always be in his power to put in his word when the circumstances should be more propitious. Thus the bargain was made, and to gain my ends, I would have made a heavier sacrifice. It is true we were within 7 degrees of the South Pole, and if the Halbrane should indeed reach that spot, it would never cost me more than $14,000. Early in the morning of the 27th of December, the Halbrane put out to sea, heading southwest. After the scene of the preceding evening, Captain Len Guy had taken a few hours' rest. I met him next day on deck, while West was going about fore and aft, and he called us both to him. "Mr. Jeorling," he said, "it was with a terrible pang that I came to the resolution to bring our schooner back to the north. I felt I had not done all I ought to do for our unhappy fellow countrymen, but I knew that the majority of the crew would be against me if I insisted on going beyond Sallel Island." "That is true, Captain. There was a beginning of indiscipline on board, and perhaps it might have ended in a revolt." "A revolt we should have speedily put down," said West coolly, "were it only by knocking Hearne, who is always exciting the mutinous men, on the head." "And you would have done well, Jem," said the captain. "Only, justice being satisfied, what would have become of the agreement together, which we must have in order to do anything?" "Of course, Captain, it is better that things passed off without violence, but for the future Hearne will have to look out for himself. His companions," observed the captain, "are now greedy for the prizes that have been promised them. The greed of gain will make them more willing and persevering. The generosity of Mr. Jeorling has succeeded where our entreaties would undoubtedly have failed. I thank him for it." Captain Len Guy held out a hand to me, which I grasped cordially. After some general conversation relating to our purpose, the ship's course, and the proposed verification of the bearings of the group of islands on the west of Sallel, which is described by Arthur Pym, the captain said, "As it is possible that the ravages of the earthquake did not extend to this group, and that it may still be inhabited, we must be on our guard in approaching the bearings." "Which cannot be very far off," I added. "And then, Captain, who knows but that your brother and his sailors might have taken refuge on one of these islands?" This was admissible, but not a consoling eventuality, for in that case the poor fellows would have fallen into the hands of those savages, of whom they were rid, while they remained at Sallel. "Jem," resumed Captain Len Guy, "we are making good way, and no doubt land will be signaled in a few hours. Give orders for the watch to be careful." "It's done, Captain." "There is a man in the crow's nest." Dirk Peters himself, at his own request. "All right, Jem, we may trust his vigilance." "And also his eyes," I added, "for he is gifted with amazing sight." For 2 hours of very quick sailing, not the smallest indication of the group of 8 islands was visible. "It is incomprehensible that we have not come in sight of them," said the captain. "I reckon that the Halbrane has made 60 miles since this morning, and the islands in question are tolerably close together." "Then, Captain, we must conclude, and it is not unlikely, that the group to which Sallel belonged has entirely disappeared in the earthquake." "Land ahead," cried Dirk Peters. We looked, but could discern nothing on the sea, nor was it until a quarter of an hour had elapsed that our glasses enabled us to recognize the tops of a few scattered islets, shining in the oblique rays of the sun, 2 or 3 miles to the westward. What a change! How had it come about? Arthur Pym described spacious islands, but only a small number of tiny islets, half a dozen at most, protruded from the waters. At this moment, the half-breed came sliding down from his lofty perch and jumped to the deck. "Well, Dirk Peters, have you recognized the group?" asked the captain. "The group," replied the half-breed, shaking his head. "No, I have only seen the tops of 5 or 6 islets. There is nothing but stone heaps there, not a single island." As the schooner approached, we easily recognized these fragments of the group, which had been almost entirely destroyed on its western side. The scattered remains formed dangerous reefs, which might seriously injure the keel or the sides of the Halbrane, and there was no intention of risking the ship's safety among them. We accordingly cast anchor at a safe distance, and a boat was lowered for the reception of Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, Dirk Peters, Holt, 2 men and myself. The still, transparent water, as Peters steered us skillfully between the projecting edges of the little reefs, allowed us to see, not a bed of sand strewn with shells, but blackish heaps which were overgrown by land vegetation, tufts of plants not belonging to the marine flora that floated on the surface of the sea. Presently we landed on one of the larger islets, which rose to about 30 feet above the sea. "Do the tides rise sometimes to that height?" I inquired of the captain. "The half-breed in the crow's nest." "The half-breed in the crow's nest." "Never," he replied, "and perhaps we shall discover some remains of the vegetable kingdom, of habitations, or of an encampment." "The best thing we can do," said the boatswain, "is to follow Dirk Peters, who has already distanced us. The half-breed's lynx eyes will see what we can't." Peters had indeed scaled the eminence in a moment, and we presently joined him on the top. The islet was strewn with remains, probably of those domestic animals mentioned in Arthur Pym's journal, but these bones differed from the bones on Sallel Island by the fact that the heaps dated from a few months only. This then agreed with the recent period at which we placed the earthquake. Besides, plants and tufts of flowers were growing here and there. "And these are this year's," I cried. "No southern winter has passed over them." These facts having been ascertained, no doubt could remain respecting the date of the cataclysm after the departure of Patterson. The destruction of the population of Sallel, whose bones lay about the village, was not attributable to that catastrophe. William Guy and the 5 sailors of the Jane had been able to fly in time, since no bones that could be theirs had been found on the island. Where had they taken refuge? This was the ever-pressing question. What answer were we to obtain? Must we conclude that having reached one of these islets they had perished in the swallowing up of the archipelago? We debated this point, as may be supposed, at a length, and with detail which I can only indicate here. Suffice it to say that a decision was arrived at to the following effect. Our sole chance of discovering the unfortunate castaways was to continue our voyage for 2 or 3 parallels farther. The goal was there, and which of us would not sacrifice even his life to attain it? "God is guiding us, Mr. Jeorling," said Captain Len Guy. Chapter 18. A Revelation. The following day, the 29th of December, at 6 in the morning, the schooner set sail with a northeast wind, and this time her course was due south. The 2 succeeding days passed wholly without incident, neither land nor any sign of land was observed. The men on the Halbrane took great hauls of fish, to their own satisfaction and ours. It was New Year's Day, 1840, 4 months and 17 days since I had left the Kerguelens, and 2 months and 5 days since the Halbrane had sailed from the Falklands. The half-breed, between whom and myself an odd kind of tacit understanding subsisted, approached the bench on which I was sitting. The captain was in his cabin, and West was not in sight, with a plain intention of conversing with me. The subject may easily be guessed. "Dirk Peters," said I, taking up the subject at once, "do you wish that we should talk of him?" "Him," he murmured. You have remained faithful to his memory, Dirk Peters. Forget him, sir, never. He is always there, before you. Always so many dangers shared, that makes brothers. No, it makes a father and his son, yes, and I have seen America again, but Pym, poor Pym, he is still beyond there. Dirk Peters, I asked, have you any idea of the route which you and Arthur Pym followed in the boat after your departure from Sallel Island? None, sir. Poor Pym had no longer any instrument, sea machines for looking at the sun. We could not know, except that for the 8 days the current pushed us towards the south, and the wind also. A fine breeze and a fair sea, and our shirts for a sail. Yes, white linen shirts, which frightened your prisoner new. Perhaps so, I did not notice. But if Pym has said so, Pym must be believed. And during those 8 days, you were able to supply yourselves with food? Yes, sir, and the days after we and the savage, the 3 turtles that were in the boat. These animals contain a store of fresh water, and their flesh is sweet, even raw. Oh, raw flesh, sir. He lowered his voice, and threw a furtive glance around him. It would be impossible to describe the frightful expression of the half-breed's face, as he thus recalled the terrible scenes of the Grampus. And it was not the expression of a cannibal of Australia, or the New Hebrides, but that of a man who is pervaded by an insurmountable horror of himself. Was it not on the 1st of March, Dirk Peters, I asked, that you perceived for the first time the veil of grey vapor shot with luminous and moving rays? I do not remember, sir, but if Pym says it was so, Pym must be believed. Did he never speak to you of fiery rays which fell from the sky? I did not use the term polar aurora, lest the half-breed should not understand it. Never, sir, said Dirk Peters, after some reflection. Did you not remark that the color of the sea changed, grew white like milk, and that its surface became ruffled around your boat? It may have been so, sir, I did not observe. The boat went on, and my head went with it. And then, the fine powder, as fine as ashes, that fell. I don't remember it. Was it not snow? Snow? Yes, no, the weather was warm. What did Pym say? Pym must be believed. He lowered his voice and continued, but Pym will tell you all that, sir. He knows, I do not know, he saw, and you will believe him. Yes, Dirk Peters, I shall believe him. We are to go in search of him, are we not? I hope so. After we shall have found William Guy, and the sailors of the Jane. Yes, after. And even if we do not find them. Yes, even in that case, I think I shall induce our captain, I think he will not refuse. No, he will not refuse to bring help to a man like him. And yet, I said, if William Guy and his people are living, can we admit that Arthur Pym? Living, yes, living, cried the half-breed. By the great spirit of my fathers, he is waiting for me, my poor Pym. How joyful he will be when he clasps his old Dirk in his arms, and I when I feel him there. And the huge chest of the man heaved like a stormy sea. Then he went away, leaving me inexpressibly affected by the revelation of the tenderness for his unfortunate companion that lay deep in the heart of this semi-savage. In the meantime, I said but little to Captain Len Guy, whose whole heart and soul were set on the rescue of his brother, of the possibility of our finding Arthur Gordon Pym. Time enough, if in the course of this strange enterprise of ours we succeeded in that object, to urge upon him one still more visionary. At length, on the 7th of January, according to Dirk Peters, who had fixed it only by the time that had expired, we arrived at the place where knew the savage breathed his last, lying in the bottom of the boat. On that day an observation gave 86 degrees 33' 2B9 for the latitude, the longitude remaining the same between the 42nd and the 43rd meridian. Here it was, according to the half-breed, that the 2 fugitives were parted after the collision between the boat and the floating mass of ice. But a question now arose. Since the mass of ice carrying away Dirk Peters had drifted towards the north, was this because it was subjected to the action of a countercurrent? Yes, that must have been so, for our schooner had not felt the influence of the current which had guided her on leaving the Falklands for fully 4 days. And yet, there was nothing surprising in that, for everything is variable in the austral seas. Happily, the fresh breeze from the northeast continued to blow, and the Halbrane made progress toward higher waters, 13 degrees in advance upon Weddell's ship and 2 degrees upon the Jane. As for the land, islands, or continent, which Captain Len Guy was seeking on the surface of that vast ocean, it did not appear. I was well aware that he was gradually losing confidence in our enterprise. As for me, I was possessed by the desire to rescue Arthur Pym, as well as the survivors of the Jane. And yet, how could he have survived? But then, the half-breed's fixed idea. Supposing our captain were to give the order to go back, what would Dirk Peters do? Throw himself into the sea rather than return northwards. This it was which made me dread some act of violence on his part, when he heard the greater number of the sailors protesting against this insensate voyage, and talking of putting the ship about, especially towards Hearne, who was stealthily inciting his comrades of the Falklands to insubordination. It was absolutely necessary not to allow discipline to decline or discouragement to grow among the crew, so that, on the 7th of January, Captain Len Guy at my request assembled the men and addressed them in the following words. Sailors of the Halbrane, since our departure from Sallel Island, the schooner has gained 2 degrees southwards, and I now inform you that, conformably with the engagement signed by Mr. Jeorling, $4,000, that is $2,000 for each degree, are due to you and will be paid at the end of the voyage. These words were greeted with some murmurs of satisfaction, but not with cheers, except those of Hurlegerly the boatswain and Endicott the cook, which found no echo. On the 13th of January, a conversation took place between the boatswain and myself of a nature to justify my anxiety concerning the temper of our crew. The men were at breakfast, with the exception of Drap and Stern. The schooner was cutting the water under a stiff breeze. I was walking between the fore and main masts, watching the great flights of birds wheeling about the ship with deafening clangor, and the petrels occasionally perching on our yards. No effort was made to catch or shoot them. It would have been useless cruelty, since their oily and stringy flesh is not eatable. At this moment Hurlegerly approached me, looked attentively at the birds, and said, I remark one thing, Mr. Jeorling. What is it, boatswain? That these birds do not fly so directly south as they did up to the present. Some of them are setting north. I have noticed the same fact. And I add, Mr. Jeorling, that those who are below there will come back without delay. And you conclude from this? I conclude that they feel the approach of winter. Of winter? Undoubtedly. No, boatswain. The temperature is so high that the birds can't want to get to less cold regions so prematurely. Oh, prematurely, Mr. Jeorling. Yes, boatswain. Do we not know that navigators have always been able to frequent the Antarctic waters until the month of March? Not at such a latitude. Besides, there are precocious winters as well as precocious summers. The fine season this year was full 2 months in advance, and it is to be feared the bad season may come sooner than usual. That is very likely, I replied. After all, it does not signify to us, since our campaign will certainly be over in 3 weeks. If some obstacle does not arise beforehand, Mr. Jeorling. And what obstacle? For instance, a continent stretching to the south and barring our way. A continent, Hurlegerly. I should not be at all surprised. And in fact, there would be nothing surprising in it. As for the lands seen by Dirk Peters, said the boatswain, where the men of the Jane might have landed on one or another of them, I don't believe in them. Why? Because William Guy, who can only have had a small craft at his disposal, could not have got so far into these seas. I do not feel quite so sure of that. Nevertheless, Mr. Jeorling, what would there be so surprising in William Guy's being carried to land somewhere by the action of the currents? He did not remain on board his boat for 8 months, I suppose. His companions and he may have been able to land on an island, or even on a continent, and that is a sufficient motive for us to pursue our search. No doubt, but all are not of your opinion, replied Hurlegerly, shaking his head. I know, said I, and that is what makes me most anxious. Is the ill feeling increasing? I fear so, Mr. Jeorling. The satisfaction of having gained several hundreds of dollars is already lessened, and the prospect of gaining a few more hundreds does not put a stop to disputes. And yet the prize is tempting. From Sallel Island to the pole, admitting that we might get there, is 6 degrees. Now 6 degrees at $2,000 each makes $12,000 for 30 men. That is $400 a head. A nice little sum to slip into one's pocket on the return of the Halbrane, but notwithstanding, That fellow Hearn works so wickedly upon his comrades that I believe they are ready to bout ship in spite of anybody. I can believe that of the recruits, bosun, but the old crew. There are 3 or 4 of those who are beginning to reflect, and they are not easy in their minds about the prolongation of the voyage. I fancy Captain Len Guy and his lieutenant will know how to get themselves obeyed. We shall see, Mr. Georling, but may it not be that our captain himself will get disheartened, that the sense of his responsibility will prevail, and that he will renounce his enterprise? Yes, this was what I feared, and there was no remedy on that side. As for my friend Endicott, Mr. Georling, I answer for him as for myself. We would go to the end of the world. If the world has an end, did the captain want to go there? True, we two, Dirk Peters and yourself, are but a few to be a law to the others. And what do you think of the half-breed? I asked. Well, our men appear to accuse him chiefly of the prolongation of the voyage. You see, Mr. Georling, though you have a good deal to do with it, you pay, and pay well, while this crazy fellow, Dirk Peters, persists in asserting that his poor Pym is still living, his poor Pym who was drowned, or frozen, or crushed, killed, anyhow, one way or another, 11 years ago. So completely was this my own belief that I never discussed the subject with the half-breed. You see, Mr. Georling, resumed the bosun, at the first some curiosity was felt about Dirk Peters. Then, after he saved Martin Holt, it was interest. Certainly, he was no more talkative than before, and the bear came no oftener out of his den. But now we know what he is, and no one likes him the better for that. At all events, it was he who induced our captain, by talking of land to the south of Sallel Island, to make this voyage, and it is owing to him that he has reached the 86th degree of latitude. That is quite true, bosun. And so, Mr. Georling, I am always afraid that one of these days somebody will do Peters an ill turn. Dirk Peters would defend himself, and I should pity the man who laid a finger on him. Quite so, it would not be good for anybody to be in his hands, for they could bend iron. But then, all being against him, he would be forced into the hold. Well, we have not yet come to that, I hope, and I count on you, Herr Legerly, to prevent any attempt against Dirk Peters. Reason with your men. Make them understand that we have time to return to the Falklands before the end of the fine season. Their reproaches must not be allowed to provide the captain with an excuse for turning back before the object is attained. Count on me, Mr. Georling, I will serve you to the best of my ability. You will not repent of doing so, Herr Legerly. Nothing is easier than to add around to the $400 which each man is to have, if that man be something more than a sailor, even were his functions simply those of bosun on board the Halbrane. Nothing important occurred on the 13th anth, but a fresh fall in the temperature took place. Captain Len Guy called my attention to this, pointing out the flocks of birds continuously flying north. While he was speaking to me, I felt that his last hopes were fading. And who could wonder? Of the land indicated by the half-breed nothing was seen, and we were already more than 180 miles from Sallel Island. At every point of the compass was the sea, nothing but the vast sea with its desert horizon, which the sun's disk had been nearing since the 21st of December, and would touch on the 21st March, prior to disappearing during the 6 months of the austral night. Honestly, was it possible to admit that William Guy and his 5 companions could have accomplished such a distance on a frail craft, and was there one chance in 100 that they could ever be recovered? On the 15th of January, an observation most carefully taken gave 43 degrees 13 letter 2b9 longitude and degrees 17 letter 2b9 latitude. The Halbrane was less than 2 degrees from the pole. Captain Len Guy did not seek to conceal the result of this observation, and the sailors knew enough of nautical calculation to understand it. Besides, if the consequences had to be explained to them, were not Holt and Hardy there to do this, and Hearn to exaggerate them to the utmost? During the afternoon, I had indubitable proof that the sealing master had been working on the minds of the crew. The men, emerging at the foot of the mainmast, talked in whispers and cast evil glances at us. 2 or 3 sailors made threatening gestures undisguisedly, then arose such angry mutterings that West could not to be deaf to them. He strode forward and called out, "Silence there, the first man who speaks will have to reckon with me." Captain Len Guy was shut up in his cabin, but every moment I expected to see him come out, give one last look around the waste of waters, and then order the ship's course to be reversed. Nevertheless, on the next day the schooner was sailing in the same direction. Unfortunately, for the circumstance had some gravity, a mist was beginning to come down on us. I could not keep still, I confess. My apprehensions were redoubled. It was evident that West was only awaiting the order to change the helm. What mortal anguish soever the captain's must be, I understood too well that he would not give that order without hesitation. For several days past I had not seen the half-breed, or at least, I had not exchanged a word with him. He was boycotted by the whole crew, with the exception of the boatswain, who was careful to address him, although he rarely got a word in return. Dirk Peters took not the faintest notice of this state of things. He remained completely absorbed in his own thoughts. Yet, had he heard West give the word to steer north, I know not to what acts of violence he might have been driven. He seemed to avoid me. Was this from a desire not to compromise me? On the 17th, in the afternoon, however, Dirk Peters manifested an intention of speaking to me, and never, no, never, could I have imagined what I was to learn in that interview. It was about 2:30, and not feeling well, I had gone to my cabin, where the side window was open, while that at the back was closed. I heard a knock at the door and asked who was there. Dirk Peters, was the reply. You want to speak to me? Yes. I am coming out. If you please, I should prefer, may I come into your cabin? Come in. He entered and shut the door behind him. Without rising, I signed to him to seat himself in the armchair, but he remained standing. What do you want of me, Dirk Peters? I asked at length, as he seemed unable to make up his mind to speak. I want to tell you something, because it seems well that you should know it and you only. In the crew, they must never know it. If it is a grave matter, and you fear any indiscretion, Dirk Peters, why do you speak to me? If I must, ah yes, I must, it is impossible to keep it there, it weighs on me like a stone. And Dirk Peters struck his breast violently. Then he resumed. Yes, I am always afraid it may escape me during my sleep, and that someone will hear it, for I dream of it, and in dreaming. You dream, I replied, and of what? Of him, of him. Therefore it is that I sleep in corners, all alone, for fear that his true name should be discovered. Then it struck me that the half-breed was perhaps about to respond to an inquiry which I had not yet made, why he had gone to live at the Falklands under the name of Hunt after leaving Illinois. I put the question to him, and he replied, It is not that, no, it is not that I wish. I insist, Dirk Peters, and I desire to know in the first place for what reason you did not remain in America, for what reason you chose the Falklands. For what reason, sir? Because I wanted to get near Pym, my poor Pym, because I hoped to find an opportunity at the Falklands of embarking on a whaling ship bound for the Southern Sea. But that name of Hunt. I would not bear my own name any longer, on account of the affair of the Grampus. The half-breed was alluding to the scene of the short straw, or lot drawing on board the American brig, when it was decided between Augustus Barnard, Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Parker, the sailor, that one of the four should be sacrificed, as food for the three others. I remembered the obstinate resistance of Arthur Pym, and how it was impossible for him to refuse to take his part in the tragedy about to be performed. He says this himself, and the horrible act, whose remembrance must poison the existence of all those who had survived it. Oh, that lot drawing! The short straws were little splinters of wood of uneven length which Arthur Pym held in his hand. The shortest was to designate him who should be immolated, and he speaks of the sort of involuntary fierce desire to deceive his companions that he felt. To cheat is the word he uses, but he did not cheat, and he asks pardon for having had the idea. Let us try to put ourselves in his place. Made up his mind and held out his hand, closed on the four slips. Dirk Peters drew the first. Fate had favored him, he had nothing more to fear. Arthur Pym calculated that one more chance was against him. Augustus Barnard drew in his turn. Saved too he, and now Arthur Pym reckoned up the exact chances between Parker and himself. At that moment all the ferocity of the tiger entered into his soul. He conceived an intense and devilish hatred of his poor comrade, his fellow-man. 5 minutes elapsed before Parker dared to draw. At length Arthur Pym, standing with closed eyes, not knowing whether the lot was for or against him, felt a hand seize his own. It was the hand of Dirk Peters. Arthur Pym had escaped death, and then the half-breed rushed upon Parker and stabbed him in the back. The frightful repast followed, immediately, and words are not sufficient to convey to the mind the horror of the reality. Yes, I knew that hideous story, not a fable as I had long believed. This was what had happened on board the Grampus, on the 16th of July, 1827, and vainly did I try to understand Dirk Peters' reason for recalling it to my recollection. "Well, Dirk Peters," I said, "I will ask you, since you were anxious to hide your name, what it was that induced you to reveal it, when the Halbrane was moored off Sallel Island. Why you did not keep to the name of Hunt?" "Sir, understand me, there was hesitation about going farther, they wanted to turn back. This was decided, and then I thought that by telling who I was, Dirk Peters of the Grampus, poor Pym's companion, I should be heard. They would believe with me that he was still living, they would go in search of him. And yet, it was a serious thing to do, to acknowledge that I was Dirk Peters, he who had killed Parker. But hunger, devouring hunger. "Come, come, Dirk Peters," said I, "you exaggerate. If the lot had fallen to you, you would have incurred the fate of Parker. You cannot be charged with a crime." "Sir, would Parker's family speak of it as you do?" "His family, had he then relations?" "Yes, and that is why Pym changed his name in the narrative. Parker's name was not Parker, it was—" "Arthur Pym was right," I said, interrupting him quickly, "and as for me, I do not wish to know Parker's real name. Keep this secret." "No, I will tell it to you. It weighs too heavily on me, and I shall be relieved, perhaps, when I have told you, Mr. Jeorling." "No, Dirk Peters, no. His name was Holt, Ned Holt." "Holt," I exclaimed, "the same name as our sailing master S." "Who is his own brother, sir?" "Martin Holt." "Yes, understand me, his brother. But he believes that Ned Holt perished in the wreck of the Grampus with the rest. It was not so, and if he learned that I—" Just at that instant, a violent shock flung me out of my bunk. The schooner had made such a lurch to the port side that she was near foundering. I heard an angry voice cry out, "What dog is that at the helm?" It was the voice of West, and the person he addressed was Hearn. I rushed out of my cabin. "Have you let the wheel go?" repeated West, who had seized Hearn by the collar of his jersey. "Lieutenant, I don't know." "Yes, I tell you, you have let it go. A little more and the schooner would have capsized under full sail." "Gratian," cried West, calling one of the sailors, "take the helm, and you, Hearn, go down into the hold." On a sudden the cry of "Land" resounded, and every eye was turned southwards. Chapter 19. Land. Land is the only word to be found at the beginning of the 19th chapter of Edgar Poe's book. I thought it would be a good idea, placing after it a note of interrogation, to put it as a heading to this portion of our narrative. Chapter 999. That word, dropped from our foremasthead, indicate an island or a continent, and whether a continent or an island did not a disappointment await us. Could they be there whom we had come to seek? And Arthur Pym, who was dead, unquestionably dead, in spite of Dirk Peters' assertions, had he ever set foot on this land? When the welcome word resounded on board the Jane on the 17th January, 1828, a day full of incidents according to Arthur Pym's diary, it was succeeded by "land" on the starboard bow. Such might have been the signal from the masthead of the Halbrane. The outlines of land, lightly drawn above the skyline, were visible on this side. The land announced to the sailors of the Jane was the wild and barren Bennet Islet. Less than 1 degree south of it lay Sallel Island, then fertile, habitable and inhabited, and on which Captain Len Guy had hoped to meet his fellow countrymen. But what would this unknown island, 5 degrees farther off in the depths of the southern sea, be for our schooner? Was it the goal so ardently desired and so earnestly sought for? Were the two brothers, William and Len Guy, to meet at this place? Would the Halbrane come there to the end of a voyage, whose success would be definitely secured by the restoration of the survivors of the Jane to their country? I repeat that I was just like the half-breed. Our aim was not merely to discover the survivors, nor was success in this matter the only success we looked for. However, since land was before our eyes, we must get nearer to it first. That cry of "land" caused an immediate diversion of our thoughts. I no longer dwelt upon the secret Dirk Peters had just told me, and perhaps the half-breed forgot it also, for he rushed to the bow and fixed his eyes immovably on the horizon. As for West, whom nothing could divert from his duty, he repeated his commands. Gratian came to take the helm, and Hearn was shut up in the hold. On the whole, this was a just punishment, and none of the old crew protested against it, for Hearn's inattention or awkwardness had really endangered the schooner, though for a short time only.